Okay, so I just want to take a couple minutes to talk about some high yield points in cell physiology as it pertains to transport and diffusion. Honestly, I think this is the most important concept in physiology. Everything else builds upon it, so you really want to have a solid understanding of it, and you really want to be able to teach it to anybody else, because if you can do that, then I really believe that you will understand so many other concepts in physiology better. Bear with me if you already know some of this information. I just want to speak through everything and add examples to it. To start with, there are two mechanisms by which anything moves in the body from compartment to compartment. It's either passive transport or it's active transport. Passive transport, by definition, means that something is moving because of diffusion. And in this case, the diffusion is always in the direction of high to low concentration. Okay. Diffusion can happen in either one of two ways. Either it's simple or it's facilitated. Facilitated. Okay, whatever. Maybe I'm spelling it wrong. Anyway, simple diffusion means that substances are basically moving through two barriers. Either it's lipid or it's through an ion channel. Okay. Now, important to note, let me just kind of change this a little bit. Important to note is that substances can move through lipids if it's nonpolar. Okay. Some examples of this is oxygen, it's carbon dioxide, it's fatty acids, or lipids. Okay. Which is why oxygen, carbon dioxide, very important molecules, can freely move in our body. If it were not through simple diffusion, we would all be dead. Okay. The other thing is that simple diffusion can happen through ion channels. Some examples of this that you should know is sodium, potassium, calcium. Okay, and I just want to diverge for a second to drive this point home. And I just want to talk about, we'll just call it the normal movement of these ions. The normal movement of potassium and sodium with regard to the cell is that sodium is always moving in, potassium is always moving out. Okay, one way to remember it is sodium moves in, there's an N in there, there's an N in sodium. I want you to memorize this. Just drive this, I'm driving this point home because if you know that this is the normal movement, everything else is abnormal, or you can just consider the other thing is the other thing. The reason why this is because the concentration of sodium out here in the ECF is very, very high compared to the inside. It's about, if you use medical numbers, 135 to 145. Within the cell, it's very low. So sodium is always moving in. By contrast, there's always much more potassium inside the cell relative to outside the cell. So potassium is always moving out. Doesn't need any proteins, doesn't need anything. All it needs is a gradient. All it needs is the fact that there's more of this out here and less of it in here, or more of this in here and less of it out here. That's it. I'll get back to that in a second. The other type of passive diffusion is facilitated. Literally all that means is that, yes, we are moving from high to low concentration, but we need some help, and we get the help of a carrier protein friend that sits there at this junction and helps stuff move in. Again, contrast that to simple, in which if this is the barrier, things are literally just drifting in or drifting out. The most important example of something that moves through facilitated diffusion, and you need to know this if you're studying medicine or anything related to it, is glucose. Okay, and I'm mentioning this because we're going to get to a different part in which glucose moves through a different way, and then you're going to be like, well, wait a minute, you just said that glucose moves through facilitated diffusion. Well, it does and it doesn't. So here's the case in which it does. Now, glucose, it's probably unnecessary, but I'll mention this anyway because it's high yield. Glucose has like over 100 types of transporters. Okay? It moves through very many different types of proteins. The most important family of proteins to know is called the GLUT family. And there's a lot of them, but we're just going to talk about proteins 1 through 4. Okay? Again, put this in your head. This is a protein. It looks like this protein. There's GLUT 1 through 4. And depending on the site of the body that we're at will determine which transporter it goes through. GLUT 1, glucose can move in and out of red blood cells. Through the GLUT 2 transporter, glucose moves in and out of either the renal system, so the kidney, or the GI, which includes the intestines. It also includes the liver and the pancreas, beta cells. Right. Glucose moves through the GLUT 3 transporter in order to get to neurons. I'll just say the brain. And this question is often always asked. They ask what type of through what type of transport does glucose get into the brain? And it's kind of a no-brainer that it has to be passive diffusion. We go into a coma if we lose a supply of glucose to the brain within minutes. There's no way in hell our body will allow the movement of glucose into the brain be dependent upon anything that requires energy, particularly ATP. So if they ever ask you this question, the answer of glucose movement into the brain is always, always, always some type of passive diffusion. And you can narrow down your answer choices to simple or facilitated, but remember in this case it's facilitated. There's also the GLUT 4 transporter, through which glucose moves into adipose tissue or fat, or it moves into skeletal muscle. Let's call it MM. And this mechanism may or may not be dependent on insulin, but that's, a different topic. So now we talked about passive diffusion. The other type of movement is active transport. Active by definition means that it's utilizing energy. It'll do it in either one of two ways. There's primary active diffusion or there's secondary. Transport. In primary, the energy source is ATP. The energy source is always ATP. And it's through a protein that's called an ATPase. An ATPase is a protein that utilizes energy via ATP in order to do the not normal things in our body, or the things that require energy by nature. So I mentioned this part of the normal, quote-unquote, normal movement of sodium and potassium, but here I want to mention we'll say the not normal, that is the not normal movement. In which instead of one moving in, the other moving out, here we have potassium moving in and sodium moving out. Now this is against its gradient. It doesn't make sense. It will never do this in its natural state. It needs a protein that's sitting right here in order to do that. Okay. Okay, and some examples of this are is ion movement. Okay, this is sodium ATPase, sodium potassium ATPase. It's pretty much all over the body. Other examples are calcium ATPase. This is in the muscle, skeletal muscle. You're going to get a question. It's going to be about an athlete, blah, 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 blah. It's going to waste your time. The final question is going to be through what mechanism will calcium move into the sarcomere or sarcoplasmic reticulum? And the answer is going to be some type of active transport. You can narrow it down to primary and secondary, but the answer is primary because it's using ATP. There's also potassium hydrogen ATPase, which is in the renal system, which you'll become very familiar with in renal physiology. So really the question is going to be something related to some system. Either it's an athlete and his muscles, either it's some guy with chronic kidney disease. And this is essentially what the question is asking, is where you can kind of categorize these and file these mechanisms. The other type of transport that's active is secondary. The energy source is an ion gradient. And what is meant by secondary active transport literally just means that we need a chaperone in order to move whatever we want to move, right? It can't move on its own. It's got to go with daddy. And in this case, the daddy is going to be sodium, right? Sodium is always, usually always, the co-transporter. Again, it will be different when we get to the renal system. But sodium, we said, by nature, moves into the cell. So if we want to bring something else into the cell, well, why don't we just like hitch a ride with this guy and get in? So, you know, if this is our barrier and this is our protein, you know, if sodium's getting through, then something else can go with it, whatever it is. We'll just say glucose in this situation because one of the examples that we have is glucose and also amino acids or proteins. Now, again, we just said, hey, glucose doesn't need energy. It can go through this little protein raft via facilitated diffusion, and it's a passive process. We don't need energy. But in some cases, yes, we do need energy in order to pull glucose into a cell. Now, let me just draw something that is often depicted in physiology because it's the best way to talk about movement between compartments. We can talk about 3 compartments. All right, this is a lumen, this is the cell, and this is the bloodstream. Okay, the lumen is the hollow tube. This is the tube of the intestines. These are the tubes in the renal system. This is the biliary canaliculi. This is the lumen. This is the cell. This is at the this contains the cell membrane, it's the epithelial border. This is where everything fun is happening. DNA is being made, RNA is being made, blah, 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 blah. Where the camp cascade is happening. And then this is the bloodstream that's pulling oxygen along, carbon dioxide along, hydrogen ions along, and this communication will be further explained in biochemistry. Anyway, the point is that the protein, the specific protein here that is moving glucose through secondary transport is a protein called SGLT. Okay, very important name to remember. SGLT sits right here. I guess we'll depict it by having this dark color. Okay, whatever. SGLT sits right here. Okay, we eat a sandwich, blah, 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 blah. We break every component down, the carb into glucose. Glucose is driving along the lumen, and then, you know, this cell needs the glucose so it can actually do things. Glycolysis, for example. And in order to get the glucose in, it brings sodium in along its gradient. Again, we just said this is the natural order of things, and with it, glucose can move with it. Okay, this is secondary active. Now, at this junction between the cell and the bloodstream, however, we have a different protein, and the protein that sits here is the GLUT protein. Okay, and it'll be a different protein depending on where we are in the body. And the GLUT, again, it's just diffusion. It's only moving glucose from one side to the other. It doesn't require any other thing. So let me just kind of use color to drive home some points. The first being that the first type of transport is passive. We can divide that into simple and facilitated. Simple will move these substances that get floating around in the blood, that need to get through the blood-brain barrier, etc., etc. And the other thing is the normal movement of ions in and out of the cell, and these are some examples. Facilitated, here, you know, your question is going to be related to something about glucose. It moves through the GLUT transporter without requiring energy. The GLUT transporter always sits here at this junction between the cell and the bloodstream. Okay, hang on. The other type of transport is active. Okay, you can divide that into primary or into secondary active. Primary always will require this little nugget of ATP. All right, secondary means that you need chaperone. Okay, you can bring your item through, which is glucose, but it needs to go along with sodium. Okay, which is doing its thing. Most important example of this is the SGLT protein, and the SGLT protein is always sitting at this junction between the lumen and the cell. Okay, this is going to cut me off, so I'm going to stop here and end it at that.